This week in Physiology Lab, we discussed hemodynamics and all of the labs and activities underneath that topic related to the concepts that are outlined in the physiology manual. So I'm just going to go over some of those just briefly, and you can fill in the holes as you continue your studying. So the first thing that we talked about with hemodynamics was how flow is related to pressure, resistance, and radius. The first law that we discussed was Ohm's law, and Ohm's law directly relates flow and pressure and indirectly relates flow and resistance. Resistance is based on blood viscosity, length, diameter, the nature of flow, and compliance of blood vessels. The most important concept to receive from this topic is that the blood vessel diameter is the primary controlling factor for resistance. So blood vessel diameter is going to be the main component of blood pressure. Vessel diameter is mainly under control of the sympathetic nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system is either going to constrict or dilate vessels depending on which type of receptors are activated. So if alpha adrenergic receptors are activated, we're going to experience vasoconstriction. If beta adrenergic receptors are activated, we're going to experience vasodilation. The next law discusses laminar flow, which is the flow through the arteries, and it describes the differential flow between the middle of the artery versus the outside of the artery. Since the outside of the artery is the portion that's going to contribute to the pressure on the blood, it's going to have a greater resistance versus the middle of the artery. Hope that wasn't too confusing. So the next law for laminar flow is comparing flow directly proportional to radius and flow indirectly proportional to resistance. And resistance in this case is as a result of viscosity, length, nature, compliance, and all the other factors that we related in Ohm's law. One of the main concepts here is that arterioles provide the greatest resistance to flow and are, again, the primary controlling factors of blood pressure because they experience the most compliance out of all of the vessels. Okay, the next thing that we discussed was the short and long-term controls of blood pressure in the body. And just to briefly summarize the short-term regulations, we have the Bainbridge reflex and the baroreceptor reflex. These two work antagonistically to raise or lower blood pressure depending on the physiological conditions. In the Bainbridge reflex, we're going to increase heart rate as a result of an increased venous return. So in other words, when we have an increased venous return to the right atrium, the stretch receptors in the most posterior aspect of the atrium are going to detect a stretch on the chamber, and therefore we're going to increase the heart rate so that we can increase the cardiac output. The baroreceptor reflex is going to work in the opposite way. We're going to have the carotid baroreceptors and the aortic baroreceptors detect an increase in blood pressure, and as a result we're going to decrease the heart rate. So in Bainbridge we're going to increase the heart rate, and baroreceptor we're going to decrease the heart rate. The mechanism of this is outlined in the manual, so I'm not going to go into the specifics, but it's important to know the difference between the carotid and the aortic mechanisms of the baroreceptor reflex. The long-term regulations of blood pressure are as a result of the endocrine system. So in order to decrease blood pressure, we have one hormone which is called ANP or ANH, and this is produced from the atrial cells when we have an increased stretch on the right atrium. So as a result, we're going to decrease blood pressure by increasing glomerular filtration rate and therefore increasing urine production. So this is overall going to decrease blood volume and therefore blood pressure. When there is an increase in blood pressure that is needed, we're going to release ADH, renin, angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2, and aldosterone. ADH is secreted from the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary gland, and it's going to cause vasoconstriction and an increased permeability to water in the collecting duct. So as a result, we're going to increase blood volume and therefore increase blood pressure. The renin-angiotensin aldosterone system is going to increase blood pressure as well by vasodilation and by sodium reabsorption. So that wraps up week 3 of Physiology Lab, and that's it.